and welcome back to Apologetics with me. I am Dr. Nancy Almodovar, and it has been my pleasure to go through these lessons on defending and proclaiming the Christian faith. So this week we began with defining terms, and that's so important when you're learning about apologetics so that you know how to answer people's questions and answer the skeptics as well. We are continuing in this lesson to go through the manuscript evidence that we have, from the earliest fragments to codexes to vellum Bibles. And so I want to welcome you, and we're going to enter in at the point where I am defining the terms that are important for this lesson, variants versus errors. So I hope you enjoy. If you have missed the live Apologetics with me lessons, please go to my website at www.lutherangirl.org, and go to the context form, fill that in, and you will get an email either Saturdays or Sundays with the link to the Zoom meeting. Well, let's get started. There we go. So today we're going to look at the variants and the errors, or what skeptics call errors. They're not errors, they're variants. Most are a different spelling. And if you think about it, like, how many ways can we spell John? Or how many ways can we spell even, we also have variants in the way cities are spelled, and even things. So when the skeptics say, oh, there's an error, no, there are variants. And we have variants in our language. And in every language, there are various ways to spell something. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. When we're looking at old writings, again, we want the earliest possible copy date, because everyone on this list, there's no originals anymore. So you want something with the earliest date to the original. And then you would also like a lot of copies. So the most of the ancient literature we have is Homer and his Iliad. It's only a 500-year distance between when he wrote that and when the copy comes. And we have 643 manuscripts, copies of Homer. But then again, you go to the New Testament and you find, at this point now, it's nearing 25,000. I was looking into some of the other texts that we may have, and one is from Hinduism, the Mahabharata, and that only has about 200 copies, and it is held that it was written roughly 3,500 years ago. But we don't have many copies of that either. But the New Testament is very close to the original autographs for its first copies. And that's earliest copies that we have. And we keep finding more. So as libraries look through their stuff, which is where most of them are being found, in Egyptian libraries, British libraries, even the Vatican has not cataloged every ancient manuscript they have in their library. We may find even earlier copies than we have now. Okay, the variants, again, the problem is the skeptics and some Christian apologists calculate variants incorrectly. And what they'll do is this. Okay, We have 5,000 manuscript copies, and 4,000 of them have Nazareth spelled wrong. Maybe it's N-E-Z instead of N-A-Z. Well, instead of just saying that's one variant of spelling, they will say, well, that's 4,000 because it's one on each of those copies. And when you're doing literature studies, you don't count the variants by the number of variants in the copies. It would have to be 4,000 different ways to spell Nazareth to really be 4,000 variants, or in the skeptics' term, errors. So when we look at variants, we're holding to the traditional university system way of counting variants. If it's spelled N-E-Z instead of N-A-Z, and it shows up that way in 4,000 copies, but it's only one variation of the spelling. So it becomes one variant. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm kind of surprised, but it does.
Okay. Well, Sally, it would be like if someone kept misspelling your word and spelling it S-A-L-L-I-E. That's really only one other way to spell your name, but maybe they put it on 5 different papers, and now the skeptics are going to say, well, they misspelled it 5 times. No, they really only misspelled it once, and people kept copying the misspelled word.
Right.
Okay. And I mentioned last week that the early church fathers, that they quoted the New Testament a lot. So I have here a little meme that was taken out of the New Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, which is an excellent, excellent resource to have. And he shows how many times they've quoted full or partial verses, and then from where. And you can see that Origen quotes it the most. 9,200 times in the Gospels, 7,700 times in Paul's epistles, and put them all together, Acts, Revelation, general epistles, he quotes it nearly 18,000 verses of the Bible. So the total number of verses in the Bible is 23,145. So that means with their total of 36,000, they've quoted some verses more than once, which is great, because then we can look at a quote from Origen, say on John 3:16, and a quote from Eusebius on John 3:16. Are they the same? Oh, look, they're identical. Well, where did they get that version of it? Must be a similar manuscript, and that must be what the original said. So that's another way that we look at what the originals say. Okay, now there are 138,000 words in the New Testament. And that's going to be important when I get to my calculations page. But just keep that in mind. There's a lot of individual words in the New Testament. And then the Greek manuscripts and the number of copies we have, like I said, has grown exponentially. But we do have a lot from up to the 3rd and 4th century. So let's go on. All right, now we're going to look at specific manuscripts. Okay, see that little piece of torn up parchment? It's actually papyrus. That is the oldest fragment that we have, and it's in the Rylands Library series. I believe that's in Britain. It was found in Egypt with a lot of other manuscript bits. They dated it from 117 to 138 AD. Put this in context. St. John the Apostle died somewhere between 105 and 110 AD. This is an extremely close copy. If he wrote his gospel in the dates that are suggested, which is before the fall of Jerusalem, because he nowhere mentions it in there. Same as the book of Revelation. He never mentions it. You're looking at, let's say this was even in AD 69, the year before the fall. You were looking at 57 years at the least to roughly 80 some odd years at the most, spacing between the original and a copy. That is extremely rare in any ancient writing. It is very rare to have something that close to the autograph. Now this little piece, I'm only showing one side, there's actually another side, so we know it was part of a codex and not a scroll, because just like our books today, we have writing on both sides of the paper. So this had writing on both. But I wanted to focus that this is John 18:31 to 33, which is the trial of Jesus with Pilate. Many skeptics used to say, no such person as Pilate. Oh wait, a couple of decades ago, archaeological dig, somebody hit their foot on, oh right, a foundation stone with Pilate's name on it and the years that he was in power in Judea. Voila, they matched up with the era of Jesus. So we now see, yes, there was a Pilate and Jesus was on trial with him. And oh, wait a minute, this fragment told us this 1900 years before we found the proof of it, which then gives proof to the fragment. What happened as well is the old skeptics, and some who just refuse to admit this, used to say, well, the Gospel of John wasn't written to the 4th or 5th century. Well, hard to find a piece from the 2nd century unless somehow they had gone time warped and placed it back 200 years before. So that's the oldest fragment we have. Okay, next oldest. This is the Chester Bt Papyri, and this one pictured is from Romans 11. Again, this totally messes up the skeptics' idea that the letters of Paul were not written till the 4th or 5th century, because this is from 2nd century. It's dated between 180 and 220 or 200 AD. Some people used to date it at 250, but it's the style of the letters that bring it to an earlier date. Okay, it's kind of like our cursive has changed, and I guess we could really see it between German cursive from 300 years ago to German cursive now. So it changes, and generations tend to change style of actual writing. Okay, so let me just skip to P45, which is another one I couldn't find a picture of. It had 30 leaves or sheets. These are papyrus, and 2 of them were from Matthew, 2 from the Gospel of John, 6 from Mark, 7 from Luke, and 13 from Acts. So they believe at the Chester Bt Library that this was a gospel codex where it had the 4 Gospels and Acts would always be included because they looked at Luke and Acts as volume 1 and volume 2. So it would have been the 5 books together. Now, the one that's pictured is Romans. That particular stack had 86 sheets from Romans, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So most of those are written by Paul. Some people question Hebrews. I personally hold that if it wasn't Paul, it may have been a disciple of Paul because they had such great knowledge of the Jewish tradition. but nobody knows. Nobody put their name to that book. But all of those were, again, in a stack when they found it. So that could have been like a letters of Paul stack. And so, again, totally messes up the skeptic's idea of the dates of the New Testament. Then we have P47, which has Revelations in 10 slightly mutilated leaves. They kind of look like what's pictured. When I was looking at the other ones, they were in even worse shape, and I thought, well, okay, I'll just stick with this one. This is actually a sheet from Revelations. So again, that messes up the skeptic's idea that the Apostle John couldn't have written the book of Revelations because that was written 400 years later. Well, again, we have a second and early 3rd century piece of the New Testament. Okay. Last week I spoke about the Bodmer Papyri. I want to go into a little bit more. These have now been dated 200 to 225 AD. Similar dates as the Chester Beatty set. Again, going by the style of writing. They had 50 Greek and Egyptian Coptic manuscripts bound together. And they were found, I believe it was near Alexandria. Yeah, near Alexandria initially, but they actually showed up in this gentleman Bodmer's library. It's almost the whole Gospel of John, large portions of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it even has some Old Testament, which is great because the New Testament's forever quoting the Old Testament. So to have portions of the Old Testament in the same or similar stacks that they're finding the New Testament kind of helps us see how things were translated as well. All right, this is P66, and you'll notice it's a stack that looks like a very, very, very abused and torn up book, which it was a codex. But this particular stack is from the Gospel of John, and it dates a little earlier than the previous ones. This is from 180 to 200 AD. Again, we're looking at 2nd or 3rd generation from the apostles themselves, copies of the New Testament. And the closer you get to the original, the more accurate the copy. So this is P72. This is a little more relaxed writing. If you look at the Greek writing here, it's a little more free-flowing. So it dates from 200 to 220. This is the earliest copy of Jude and Peter's letters that we have. And it has some apocryphal books as well, which means some of the Old Testament apocrypha that the Jewish people did not believe was inspired and inerrant. They're more the history books, Maccabees, Bel and the Dragon, and those books. P75. It used to have 144 pages. Somehow in the researching it and studying it and the scientific observation of it, they lost 42 pages. So we only have 102 left. But it is the Gospel of John again. And this one dates 175 to 225 AD. So this particular copy of John is the most valuable that we have, which witnesses to the original text because it's within a generation of the apostles. So that's the Bodmer. Okay. All right, now we're going to get into some really interesting things. Christians were, early Christians were very creative in making letters become a brand new meaning. They'd combine 2 letters. I think a lot of us know the Cairo which is the R and the cross, and it's this symbol with an X, not a P, but this is the tau row, and it's called a staurogram. The stauros, which is the upright pale or stake, always references the cross. And then the row means a letter kind of imprinted on that stauros. So these two letters, the tau row, the T and the R, which we look at as a P, is an R, the early Christians would take a word such as cross and replace it with the tau row, meaning Christ's cross. Not your cross, but Christ's cross. And this is interesting how this gets worked in here. Okay. Do you see that little circled in yellow area? Okay.
Yes.
Do you see the center letter?
Yep.
What's it look like to you guys?
The tau row.
It is. It is. That's in the manuscript from the Bt Papyri, P75. And this is the verse that it's changing the cross to become Christ's cross. Whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So the tau row becomes a typical way in almost all the Greek manuscripts after this point to write out cross. It always referenced back to Jesus on the cross. Now there's an interesting thing about this little cross that I found out this week. Okay, so they kind of zoomed in on it a little bit more, and you can see the tau row again. The head is drooping. It's not upright. The top of the P, or the row, is falling to depict the death of Jesus. And again, this became something that pictured for the reader the death of Christ on the cross. When I started finding this, there were a whole bunch of other things that the manuscript writers did to overlay 2 or 3 letters that would depict Jesus and his various offices, or his dual nature of God and man. And it ended up down a rabbit hole and a rabbit trail, but I didn't want to do that with us today. So, but it's an interesting thing. In the catacomb pictures, we find Christ depicted as the Good Shepherd, the Chi row, okay, the row with the X, a dove, a phoenix. We all know the legend of the phoenix rose from the dead, right? And changed. Okay, the tree of life he's pictured as an anchor, and then the Alpha and Omega. But in some of the earliest manuscripts, we have this tau row, which when it speaks of the cross is telling us, yes, you must pick up your cross, but the cross is the cross of Christ. It is Christ himself. Okay, and there's the Chi row. Any questions on the tau row and the manuscripts using that instead of writing out cross? Okay. All right. The next oldest that we have is a near complete copy of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's called the Codex Vaticanus. Anyway, Vaticanus. It's the oldest on parchment and vellum, animal skin, no longer using papyrus. Animal skin lasted longer. Parchment lasted longer. So you didn't have the papyrus falling apart, and now you don't have a decent copy of the New Testament. This is from 325 to 350 AD. And it has most of the Septuagint, or the 70 version of the Old Testament, the LXX, and most of the New Testament, but Timothy through Philemon's missing, and then Hebrews 9:14 to Revelation is missing. And it's not that it wasn't there. They can tell by the condition those pages are out of the book. They've torn, broken, however, they came apart. But this particular text, written in the early to mid 4th century, again, because it's all the Gospels and Acts. So the skeptic cannot say, oh, that wasn't written till, after Constantine, because it's written before Constantine. So again, this is one way to answer the skeptic, because you're going to have people coming up and, well, that New Testament, that was just written after Constantine. And after the meeting in Constantinople where he decided everybody had to be a Christian. Really, because now we have copies that are reading the same as the copies we have today in English over in the Greek, from 125 to 325, 350 AD, same thing. So it's impossible for them to stick with that argument. And if they do, then they're just being stubborn and they won't move. And if even with all the proof you show them, they don't move from their position that it was written in the 4th or 5th or 6th century, then you have to really move on, because they're not admitting to clear, tangible evidence that we have. Okay. The next copy we have is Codex Sinaiticus. Now, we didn't know we had this till around the 1400s, when the Vatican went, oh, look what we found in our library. This is a completely different way to set up the writings of Scripture. When you open it, it almost becomes scroll-like. You see the 4 columns on each page. And you could just read, and they purposely set the line breaks as what we would consider paragraph or thought breaks. So you could read a whole section, and that's one whole thought. Next section, one whole thought or teaching. They believe, because Eusebius mentions it in his church history, after Constantine converted to Christianity, he requested that 50 official copies of the New Testament and the Old Testament be done for the emperor, his officers, the Senate, his family. They don't know how many more of these copies they will find, but they did find an older one in a monastery, St. Catherine's, and it's pretty beat up. But this one is actually in pretty decent shape. It's on vellum, so it survived. It has the entire New Testament in it. Okay. Any questions on the manuscripts that I spoke about? No, no. Okay. So the variants, again, they say, the skeptics say 200,000 errors. Yeah, spread out over 5,300 manuscripts. Strictly grammatical. Spelling error. Name of a place error. But not a name of a place like it happened in Bethlehem and they wrote it happened in Alexandria. We're talking they misspelled Bethlehem or they misspelled Alexandria. But again, like I said earlier, the skeptics count each misspelled name or place or thing as an error for each of the manuscripts that variant in spelling shows up in the manuscripts. And Westcott and Hort, those guys are the experts on manuscripts. I have their works, and you kind of go cross-eyed reading it because it's very technical. But turns out 98.33% of the New Testament is pure, which means it matches up identically with the earlier manuscripts. 400 words in the 200,000 that they talk about alters the meaning. In other words, some manuscripts talk about Mary's other children, but it doesn't use the word children. It calls them Jesus's cousins. So that would be different than step brothers and sisters. Okay, that's the type of altering, nothing of real significance, and not one variant affects an article of faith or a precept of duty, according to Philip Schaft in his work on the early church. All the variants do is like the one regarding Nazareth and a city of Judea. Okay, well, if you read a New Testament that says this took place in a city of Judea, you're not going to know where on the map it actually took place. So they call that real significance. But does that affect our faith and what Christ did? Nope, not at all. Okay, so I did some calculations. There are 138,162 individual words in Greek in the New Testament. I don't know how many there are in the English. I'm sure there's probably a few more. If we just use the full manuscripts, okay, not the little pieces I was showing you, but full page, 5,300. I calculated it. That means 732,258,600 words in total for all the manuscripts. And if there really are 200,000 words in question, it results in less than 0.0003% of the New Testament is in question. And I went back to my notes from the Academy last year, and Dr. Montgomery mentioned that. And he gave it 0.3% of the New Testament would be in question. No expert in antiquities would ever say, if it were another book, that it discounts the entire book. But for some reason, the experts seem to think that discounts the entire Bible. You know, if you take an early copy of Shakespeare, compare it to an early copy of the New Testament, let's do Sinaiticus. The early copy of Shakespeare is going to be very, very different than what you're picking up from Penguin Books. Does that discount that it's a book by Shakespeare, even though it's going to be different than the original? Nobody would say, oh, yeah, that means Shakespeare didn't write it. But yet in the New Testament, if there's one little dot or iota missing on a document, the skeptics are going to say, well, throw out the whole document. You don't do that. And you don't do it on any paperwork, you know. So I have here the number of lines, and I'll go back to Mahabharata. Number of lines, 124,000. Number of lines in question, 26,000. So it only has an accuracy of 90%. There was no Hindu on this earth who would then reject the book of Mahabharata. The same with Iliad. 764 lines in question. Only 95% accurate. Nobody's going to reject the story of Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. But yet, with only 40 lines or 400 words of the New Testament, they're going to want to use that to reject it. So you kind of have to keep in mind, you don't have to keep the numbers in mind, but you have to keep in mind how much more accurately the New Testament has been copied. And these were not professional secretaries or scribes copying the Gospels in the New Testament. This was you and me type of people who are just going, oh, this letter from Paul was read at church today. Pastor, can you let me make a copy for my family who lives over in, I don't know, Alexandria or Rome and or Athens, and I want to make a copy. And so it's them. It's everyday Christians making the copy of the letter and trying to be as accurate as possible. And maybe they didn't understand some scripts that the person put in there. Yet, when we take together all the copies, we are amazed at how much is similar. And it is just incredible that 99.5% of the New Testament is the same as the originals. Trying to find in my notes here. One expert put together the number of real variants way down to about 3,000. Yeah. I can't, I'll have to find it later. But when we look at the variants of spelling, a variant of a place or a thing, that doesn't affect the doctrine and what we are taught. It doesn't affect who Jesus Christ is, and it doesn't affect who we should be believing in and how we should live. The variants, skeptics want to bring it up. When I started Googling and researching for this lesson, every atheist blog popped up that this proves this isn't the New Testament. And people on the blog were trying to explain, wait a minute, if you held that same standard for this, and this work of antiquity, you'd have to throw them out. The history of the Gaelic Wars, you'd have to throw out almost completely, because there's so many variants in the few copies that we have. So if you're going to say a 0.5% variation in the New Testament throws out the whole thing, then you need to take out the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Gaelic Wars, Caesar's writings, and several religious books. And you just have to toss them out then. But they won't do that with other books. They'll only do that with the New Testament. And so you kind of have to hammer home that even the unbelieving, honest experts don't throw out the New Testament just because it has a few variations of spelling, you know, a noun instead of a verb somewhere, or just something like that. But that's our manuscripts that back us up, which is why I keep saying we go by the testimony of the apostles. What was their focus in evangelism? It was always going to the documents of the Old Testament and the eyewitnesses of the apostles, which are now for us written in the scriptures. And we can prove 99.5% accuracy. That's a high accurate rate. So, okay, time for a few questions if you have any.
Well, I have one.
Okay.
Mine's more of just a class question. So this proves that it was written, the documents were written by who said they were, who had said they were, and when it said they were. But it doesn't prove that the content was true. It just proves that, you know, John could have been writing a fable. That doesn't mean he was. I know there's other, we talk about means, motive, and other things that they would have had. We talk about the eyewitnesses and how it wasn't perfect, you know, a perfect match, which means, you know, if you made up the story, they would match perfectly. Are we going to be getting on to progressing in that direction in the class? I didn't know how many lessons we had here.
Well, we will. And part of the reason that we don't hold it as fable is because for this report, they all willingly laid down their lives. Even John, he died of old age, but he did get boiled in oil, and he did get sent off to an island all by himself. Nobody dies for a lie they personally know is a lie. So we're going to get into that, and how it goes for the disciples. Either they were liars or lunatics. Not
Right.
that they were Lord, but they were either liars. And why die for a lie you know to be a lie?
Well, someone promises you, I'll give your family 500,000 rubles if you do this, or I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just saying I want to be able to refute those type of questions, which, would come up. So we can now, again, I've been through all this with you, so I know how this ends, but there's a progress. You talk about the content, and is it true? And then is the content, is it written by who they said they was? And then the next step is, all right, well, what about the content of what they wrote? Is it true? And was it witnessed, and did it corroborate with, and people talk about the contradictions. And I remember last year they talked about the car wreck, and remember the one, he was hit in the wreck, but he drove off and died later. I forget the exact story, but those type of things are fascinating. Do we even understand what a contradiction is and all that? So that's probably maybe beyond the scope of what you're doing, but I just remember all that being fascinating. It's very interesting.
I remember that story too, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to have to remember that for when that ever comes up. So far in my own talks with people, it hasn't. What has, on the idea of they knowingly lied, is Joseph Smith. Now, he was found guilty in a trial in Kinderhook, New York, and people say, well, he died. He kept teaching this, but you know what? I don't think he expected to get shot and killed that day.
That's true. But I think that type of thing is the most difficult to give an answer for. We can prove the documents. We could show that if we believe the documents, what Jesus said is true. It's that in-between part.
Right.
All right. How can we prove the content?
Right.
That's the hardest part for me.
Oh, absolutely. And that is difficult because you're looking then at motive. So
right.
Then you have to actually go to the epistles of Paul and even Peter and John's letters and see, well, what was their motive with these people? Oh, it was to have and live by the highest level of integrity. And yet they knew they were lying? Like, you're telling people to live the absolute most honest, and it could put you in the Colosseum with the wild beasts kind of life. And yet they're the ones lying to you about that. I mean, they would have had to have been clinically insane.
And lots of them. Yes, that's true.
Right. And then not one broke from the story. Not a one. Under torture, under, the worst type of executions, not one breaks. So you have to look at that as well. Most people, like, we call it waterboarding. Well, back then they had, let's put arrows in your feet or hands and not really kill you yet, but we're just going to do that so you tell us the truth. And the story was still the same. This is what we saw. Jesus rose again from the dead physically. So, yeah, but I'll get into intent and fable or cute story or real historical event.
Great. I look forward to that. And I know it's a difficult section, and it's the one I struggle the most with. So thank you.
Okay, no problem. Any other questions on the manuscripts today, on the variants, or even anything off that topic that we've dealt with already? Nope. Okay. All right, then have a great rest of the week.